talk about motivation, and I would like to argue that it is the strongest predictor of performance across the board. It colors everything the athletes or the coaches experience. It will significantly impact the way you experience success or failure. I'll try to make the point in this presentation that is something that we should follow very carefully. So actually, when you look at the word motivation, I was limited on time, so I actually color-coded it to help you see that there's two words in the word motivation. You actually see why motivation is about not only the direction of the behavior, but also the intensity of the behavior. So when we talk about motivation, it's a lot about the motive behind the action, so the goal behind the behavior. And our natural tendency is to actually look at our athletes and think, if I was doing the same thing she's doing, this is what I would mean by that behavior. And most of the time, there's a real risk for making a mistake when we interpret without asking the athlete, what are you actually trying to achieve here, and what are your intentions behind your behavior? We have a big risk of making a mistake. So one way to better understand motivation is to use self-determination theory. According to self-determination theory, people are driven by the fulfillment of three basic psychological needs. When you fulfill those needs, you show high quality of motivation, and then when you struggle to fulfill those needs, you experience lower levels of quality of motivation. The first of three basic psychological needs is the need for competence. In sports, such as triathlon, this need is very salient. Most of our athletes, they train every day, they compete on a regular basis, a lot because they feel competent at what they're doing. So whether it is the fact that they love moving through the water and feel that when they try to accelerate, they actually manage to accelerate, or they have a very good feeling when they're biking up a hill, going around a corner, experiencing that they have high levels of skills, that they can express themselves really well through that activity. It gives them a feedback of competence. They can get a feedback from the coach or get feedback from the environment they compete in. And this fulfillment of a need for competence make them want to come back to this environment over and over again. The second of the three basic psychological needs is the need for autonomy. It refers to this feeling that you actually made a choice of being involved in training, of being involved as a triathlete, or being involved as a coach. You have ownership over your participation in both in training and in competition, and you're self-driven. This need for autonomy may be experienced differently from one athlete to the other. It is universal, so everybody has this need, but when we look at our athletes, we typically see different ways of fulfilling this need. So you have some athletes that are more like they like things in boxes, like really clearly defined. They like to have a coach that will give them an indication of what is the purpose with the training, when does the training start, and when is the goal for the training achieved. Other athletes, they're more like the artist type, where they like to just be explained what the goal of the training is, but they like to figure out themselves what are the ingredients that should go in the training. And then you have most of the athletes that are between those two poles. So although athletes may fulfill that need in different ways, every athlete that we coach has this need for a degree of autonomy. And then the third of the three basic psychological needs is the need for social relatedness. And it's a feeling that you are meaningfully connected to some people around you. So again, for some people to be connected to 1, 2, 3 people is enough. A very deep connection, very meaningful connection. And then you also have other individuals that need to feel that they are communicating with 100 or 1,000 followers through social media, for example, and this connection is meaningful to them and will help them fulfill their need for relatedness. So how does it work in practice? Well, in practice, we'll have our athletes trying to fulfill these 3 basic psychological needs in their participation in triathlon. And if they are so lucky that all these 3 needs are fulfilled, then they will typically be motivated by a form of motivation we call intrinsic motivation. It is the highest quality form of motivation. If the fulfillment of these needs is challenged, then they may need reasons outside themselves to keep on being involved in training and in competition. It can be, for example, that if being a triathlete gives meaning to them, they see it as a vocation. They were born to have that role of being a triathlete. It may be enough to have them stay involved and complete their training at a very high level. It can be that their ego is involved in the fact that they've invested a lot in training and in becoming really good at what they're doing. For some athletes at a higher level, money or external rewards may become very important. So let's say you had a long career, you actually saw the Olympics as a very nice way to finish your career. You end up having the best race of your life at the Olympics, and then you get a lot of opportunities to make a substantial larger amount of money if you keep on competing after the Olympics. So this external reward may actually motivate you to keep on going for a few more years than you had actually anticipated to start with. At the very end of this continuum, you have amotivation, which is the absence of motivation, where you sort of feel that there's no connection between what you invest in training and competing and what you get out of it. And it is often related to athletes finding themselves in a state of exhaustion. So what's interesting to see here is that this continuum is dynamic. So you have your athletes that can be most of the time at this end of the continuum, but then they will experience these periods where, you know, for example, it is November in Edmonton. It's really cold, it's windy, it's rainy, it's dark outside. It's not really fun to go out and train twice a day, but because they have this pride of being an elite athlete, of being successful when they compete, when spring comes around, then it's enough to get them out of the house and actually training, even though it's not something that is very pleasurable. So the idea here is that there's no problem in being motivated by the more external reasons to do something. However, you shouldn't stay there for too long, because if you stay at this end of the continuum too long, there is a larger chance that you will end up being amotivated and exhausted at one point. So once you feel that you've gone through several days being motivated by things that are outside of you, then you should react and actually take a break, figure out what you need to do to have fun and find that it's meaningful for you to train or to compete, and then hopefully go back to in this direction on the continuum. So do you see how it's dynamic and how these 3 needs have an impact on the quality of your motivation? So I'd like to talk to you about one athlete I worked really closely with. Tora Berger is, she's a biathlete from Norway. When I started working with Tora, she was about to make the Guinness World Record book for the most amount of 4th places on the World Cup. a lot of my colleagues, they didn't really want to work with that team because it was a team that traditionally had a lot of issues, and then they saw their best racers as somebody who was accustomed to fourth places, so they thought maybe the team was doomed. Being a foreigner in my host country, I thought I had nothing to lose, so I was very happy to get that opportunity. We prepared really, really well, or as well as we could as a team, and I was part of the coaching staff for the Olympics in Vancouver. And then Tura had been on the podium 3 times before the Olympics in Vancouver, so she came at the Olympics as being one of our medal candidate and a favorite to come back home with a medal from the Olympics. So in the first race of the Olympics, which was the sprint, she finished 34th. So you being accustomed to elite sport, if you're one of the favorites to finish on the podium and you're 34th in the first race, it is seen as disappointment. And then the second race in the Olympics in biathlon is a pursuit. So you start the race with the same amount of time behind the winner that you ended up in the sprint race. So when you start the race in 34th place in the pursuit, the chances of ending up on the podium are very, very small. So a lot of the people around Tura started telling her that she should perhaps consider not racing that race and just wait a few days, hope for her physical form to come back, and then maybe compete at the end of the Olympics and then come back with a medal at home. So we had a few talks around the different possibilities that were in front of her after that disappointing first race. And in one of the talks we had, I brought up with her the fact that she had been looking, as she was coming in the shooting range, she looked up at the big screen where like the people are being filmed and where the results are during the race. And I told her that surprised me a lot because I had never seen her watch the big screen in a competition before. I said, you know, you're typically an ice queen when you race. You are very serious, very concentrated on your things, and you don't seem to be registering anything that is around you. But yesterday in the race, you were looking up at the screen all the time. So that really surprised me. And then we started talking about why she may have been doing that, and then she figured out herself that probably she was like a sort of a reaction to the fact that finally you made it to the Olympics, finally you're racing at the Olympics, everything is really big, and then she got really stressed out and she didn't react her normal self during the race. So we found together that maybe it was a good idea for her to stick to the plan. She had planned to race all 5 races during the Olympics. She was well prepared to race all 5 races, and she decided to enter the pursuit the day after. Well, she ended up finishing 5th in the pursuit. So it was the first time somebody started so far down the field and went up so many positions in the race. And then the 3rd race at the Olympics is the normal distance, we call it, where it's an individual race, and she ended up winning gold in that medal, in that race. So had she actually skipped the 2nd race and rested, as a lot of the people in her entourage were suggesting, we're not sure if she would have had the confidence actually that the pursuit gave her to win a gold medal in the 3rd race. After she came back from the Olympics, thing went really well. She had a good season on the World Cup the year after. And then I come to this, just so it was a long introduction to this newspaper article. I was going to give a presentation to the Ministry of Health, and then I thought, I'm going to talk about this athlete. She's definitely showing great signs of motivation. Everybody knows her. She's a superstar in her country. So I'm going to build my whole presentation around this athlete. So I wake up a little early that morning before the kids are up. I go and get the newspaper. I think I'm going to have a cup of coffee and quick breakfast, and then I'll jump in the car and go and give my talk. And then I open the sports section of the newspaper. And it may surprise you, actually, that in the sports section in Norway, they have big articles about biathlon, but it is the case in Norway. So the big article that day was about Tura, and the title was that she felt less motivated. So my first reaction was to close the newspaper, and I thought, I'll jump in the car, and maybe I'll get to my presentation before they all had time to read the newspaper, and then I don't have to change anything. But then I thought maybe it was foolish to think that they had not read the newspaper, so I thought I'll read the article and see what she says. So basically what she says is, it's not fun anymore to train every day. There are days when I'd rather be somewhere else than to drag myself out to train. I train a little bit out of obligation just to avoid having a bad conscience. I have goals I want to accomplish, which is why I have to do what is necessary. Yes, I was more motivated before. It's harder to find reasons to motivate myself. I have a sports psychologist, but it's not a big problem. I hope to succeed this year and the next. I think it helps me to know when it will all be over. I feel certain now that it's all over after the next season. Well, the first thing I reacted to was that sentence where she says, I have a sports psychologist, but it's not a big problem. Not sure what she was, and I chose to think that she was wrongly cited for that. But basically what she says is, like we all feel, sometimes it's harder to get out of the house and train. Sometimes it's not as fun to train as it used to be. Sometimes you have a goal that is such far down the road that it doesn't pull you out of the house when it's cold and it's raining outside. And I think it's important to realize that motivation fluctuates, and that every athlete may have a few days or a few weeks where they don't seem to be motivated, but they don't have to throw their whole season or their whole career out of the window. What's really important when that happens is to actually take the time to sit down and analyze what used to drive me. What used to make this fun? What used to make this meaningful for me, that actually, even when it rained and even when it was cold, I wanted to get outside and I wanted to train? The way we tackled it is, I called her after my presentation that morning, and I made an appointment with her. And then we started discussing this, and I also told her that next time she had that big of a thing to tell me, she could just call me and not tell a journalist first. But we sat down and we started talking about things that could make this coming season meaningful. And one thing that was really important that year is that we had a training camp in May where we had made like a mock competition. So instead of shooting 4 times, they were shooting 5 times, so 25 shots. And they were simulating a race between the times they were coming on the range. And she ended up shooting 24 of 25 that day and finishing over 2 minutes in front of the second girl on the team who had also won some medals on the World Cup the year before. So what do you do with an athlete who's already at such a high level and performing at such a nearly impossible level of performance 6 months before the season starts? Your job as a coach is to find the small things that are meaningful for them to work on, and they can't just work on things that will just keep them at that level for 5 months, because it's just not that much fun to work on just staying at that level for 5 months before the World Cup season starts. So we talked about things that were meaningful to her. We had to create something that was outside what we had seen before, because she was already performing at such a level that we couldn't compare to external references. So we combined a dream season where she would shoot as a high percentage as the best girl from the year before, who had made like a record year in terms of percentage on the shooting range, and that she would shoot as quick as the fastest guy. And she was convinced that there were no physiological reason for why the guys would be able to shoot faster than the girls. So we called it our Annie Oakley project. For you guys that don't know Annie Oakley, she was a very famous call girl, a very fast shooter in the cowboy and Indian time many, many years ago. We decided that that was going to be our project, and we weren't going to share it with anybody else, but we were going to talk about it regularly throughout the whole season. So we reminded each other of the project. We had a bet based on the project, and if she succeeded at shooting over 90% for the whole season and keeping her range time lower than the best guy, I was going to buy her a bottle of wine that was going to change her wine experience for the rest of her life. And if she lost the bet, then she would race a mountain bike race with me. She thought sounded like really, really horrible, because it's a race with 18,000 participants. So we had this secret bet going, and then even at the Worlds that year, before every race at the World Championships, we did talk about how she needed to prepare in order to have a very high precision in her shooting and to have very fast time on the range. So this is how it went with Tura that year in February. So this article was in September. So February is 5 months later. And then Tura ended up winning 6 medals at the World Championships, 4 golds and 2 silver. And on the World Cup that year, she won all 8 Crystal Globes. So she also made history on the World Cup. So she went from struggling with motivation, not thinking this is fun anymore, being happy that the whole career would be over in a little over a year, to being historical in her performances. So I think it's really important for the athletes to recognize that this is normal. It's normal that motivation goes up and down, and that it is possible to do something with it. So I'll explain some things that we can do to help our athletes adjust their motivation along the way. So one of the things that is important is the feeling of mastery. And I really like this definition here. Psychological forces that drive an individual to try to solve a problem or to develop a skill that is difficult for the individual. So instead of seeing the mastery feeling as something that is a result of achieving something, they actually suggest that the mastery feeling is the initial drive that you need in order to do something that is special and that is hard. So one way to increase your likelihood to experience mastery is to actually set goals. So if you set 1 goal per day, or let's say you set 2 goals per day, and you're so lucky to meet one of those 2 goals, that's 1 mastery experience a day. If you set 10 goals for your day and you meet half of those goals, that's 5 mastery experiences. So setting goals is actually a very good strategy in order to experience mastery more often and get a lot of that fuel that will drive your involvement and your efforts in triathlon. So here are just some things that you have to remember when you set goals. So goals should be specific and measurable. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's specific. Yes, no, that's specific. Doing my best is not specific. It's weather dependent, it's humor dependent. It is a really bad goal. Set ambitious but realistic goal. Remember, the idea here is to achieve the goal so that you experience mastery. So ambitious, so you stretch yourself and it's meaningful, but it has to be realistic, otherwise you're not going to reach it. So this is really bad news for perfectionists. You know, perfectionism never happens. So there's always a way to perfect whatever you're working on or whatever you've achieved. So if you have some perfectionistic athletes or colleagues, let them know that they're in trouble. Set short-term and long-term goals so that you actually have a chance of reaching some of those goals in a very short-term period, and then have those long-term goals that actually are powerful and give a direction to your efforts. Set goals for training and competition. Actually, Russ was talking earlier about like the 10,000 hour rule. Expertise researchers, they've found that you need to have a certain amount, let's say many thousand replication of a skill at a very high level before you can call yourself an expert at that skill. So let's say you have, hypothetically, you have to do something 5,000 times before you can call yourself an expert at it. Well, if goal setting and achieving a goal is a skill, and you have to set a goal and achieve it 5,000 times before you're an expert goal setter and goal achiever, well, if you set goals only for your races, and you race, let's say, 20 races a year, and you're so lucky to achieve your goals half of the time, that's 10 goal achievement a year, and you needed to achieve 5,000. So that means you would need a career of about 500 years in order to become an expert at achieving goals. So if you want to become an expert much faster, you need to do that for training as well as in competition, because you have so many more training sessions. And then set positive goals. I think it's really important that the athletes understand that the language they're using for their goals gives direction to their behavior, and they should be very careful to use positive expressions. One of the things that is important for us to tell the athletes is that when we are anxious or we're stressed out by a situation, our brain has a tendency to simplify things. So let's say your goal is not to slide out in that corner that looks really slippery. So not slide out when you're really stressed out will be slide out, slide out, slide out. And then as you're starting to slide, then you only hear in your head out, 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 and all of a sudden you're out of the course. All right, so if you want to stay in the course, use some positive expressions, for example, like stick to the ground. So get those tires to stick to the asphalt, and then you'll see that you go a lot longer with your goal. Develop precise strategies to achieve your goals. I'll come back to that with an example. Set specific dates. If your athlete is sick or injured, change those dates. This is not something, it's not a prison. You remember the goal of having a goal setting program is to experience mastery. So if likelihood for achieving those goals changes because you've become injured or sick, then you should just change the date. Use your logbook or training log to monitor this, and then assessment with the help of the coach and adjustment are critical to success, of course. So you see how goals and motivation are linked to each other. If you look at all the different goals our athletes are trying to achieve, you would probably be able to sample many hundred, maybe many thousand goals that they try to achieve. But there is a way to categorize them. So there's two different categories for these goals. One is called the result-oriented goal. And the athletes that are result-oriented, or the coaches that are result-oriented, focus on doing better than others. So the focus here is normative comparison. So comparing your own performance with the one of others around you. You use other as reference, and demonstrate ability of where others is how it works. Also, if you can avoid showing lack of ability or doing well with as little effort as possible, that is the gold standard. And then the other type of goal is mastery-oriented goals. So the goal achievement criteria for those goals is to feel that you've successfully completed a task. You've actually learned something, you demonstrated high levels of effort, or that you feel that you've developed personally through this activity or this competition. So the goal is self-referenced. So if you actually feel that you've developed or learned something, or did something better today than you could do yesterday, then you are definitely achieving that goal. What we found in the research looking at environments that are emphasizing these goals is that athletes that perceive their team or their surrounding as very result-oriented are more prone to experiencing anxiety and concentration. It's not very hard to understand why, you know. Let's say your goal is to win, and you will only achieve your goal if the others you're competing with do worse than you do that day. So how much influence do you have on the performance of others around you? Well, very little. You only have influence on your own performance. So if your goal is really, really important to you and is to beat everybody else in the field, it can be quite difficult to feel calm and in control of your goal, because it doesn't lie within you. It actually is dependent on the others not delivering a higher performance than you do that day. And also, what happens to your concentration, you're always comparing yourself to the others around you, so you're actually looking around to see how you're doing in relationship to the others, so your concentration is not on yourself, but it's on the others around you. And then when we looked at environments that were more mastery-oriented, then we found that those environments, they produce two important stress buffers for the athletes. One was self-confidence on experiencing personal skills development, because they're only using self-reference cues for their progression. And the other thing is that athletes help each other develop, and they see it as a natural thing to give information to their teammates and share knowledge with their teammates, because they're not busy trying to compare themselves to the others around them, but they're actually more busy developing themselves and having a self-reference goal to achieve. All right, this is something that you may have heard. It has become a cliche in the business world. So if you have a good process, you will get good results. So the results are only as good as the process. Well, now I'll try to stretch this a little further and ask you for some participation in my talk. So this is my first question to you guys. What equals 1 + 2? And it's not a trick question. 3. All right. I heard that there were some really, really good triathletes and a very good triathlon group in Madrid. So let's say we were all lucky to travel together to Madrid, and I asked you in Madrid, what is 1 + 2? And it's still not a trick question. 3. Okay, so no matter when or where we are, 1 + 2 = 3. Do you agree? So here's a harder question. What equals 3? I'll help you. 1 + 2. Other possibilities. Okay, other possibilities? Okay, we could be here for many hours and we wouldn't come to the bottom of this. Do you agree? Okay, so if 1 + 2 is the process and 3 is the result, if you only concentrate on the result, there's an endless amount of possibilities to get where you want to get. However, if you concentrate on the process and you make a plan that is really, really good with really competent people helping you to make a really good plan, and you commit to that plan and fulfill that plan 100%, you will always end up where you want to end up. So if you have one thing to remember from my talk today, I would say that if you remember that success in triathlon is as easy as 1 + 2, then you remembered something really good about the talk. Just to pull in some of the other stuff, the hard science in the picture. Well, research has shown that goal achievement, and in some of the initial research, it was about if you won versus if you lost. But actually, now that we better understand the meaning of winning, we can actually see that achieving something will create a very different hormonal reaction in an individual than experiencing defeat. So it will have an important effect on your recovery and there again on your long-term success. So I think it's important for athletes to understand that setting goals and achieving these goals are very important for not only for their mental health, but also for their athletic progression. So it's not only to do goal setting, but it's to understand how you set up a goal setting process with goals that are achievable, with goals that are making you want to stretch yourself to achieve them, but again, that you will at one point achieve, so you have this mastery experience so that you actually benefit from this achievement feeling. And then there are also these research findings suggesting that defeat or disappointment has an effect on your brain structure. So if you experience defeat over and over and over again, or disappointment over and over again, you will have changes in your brain structure that will lead to serious conditions such as depression. But another hypothesis is that the premotor cortex here, that is very, very important in the development of skills in our elite athletes, seems to be affected by this feeling of disappointment and defeat. And what usually is analyzed and assimilated in the premotor cortex and then sent to the back of your brain so that you can actually say that it has become automatized and you can use it over and over again every time you need it. Well, that process doesn't happen in athletes that have experienced very, very serious disappointment at one point in their career. It may take many weeks or many months to actually recover from those disappointments. And then the last slide I have is from some military research. Hatfield in the US has done some very interesting stuff, and some of the stuff he has done with soldiers is really cool, and it'd be really neat to do with athletes. However, we will never have the budget that the military have, so we have to look at what they do with their soldiers. Why it is interesting to see what they've done with their research is that this one study here, they had a group of elite soldiers going in a very difficult situation to take out a soldier that had been captured and was held in captivity. One of the group had a very good explanation of what they had to achieve in order to get the soldier out of harm's way and out of the difficult situation as quickly as possible, while the other group that had the same, let's say, talent in order to do the thing really well, they went in the same situation without a plan, just with the skills they had been training. And what they found is that in the soldiers that had a plan, that knew exactly what they were going to do to retract the soldier that had been captured, those soldiers used really small part of their brain to do the mission right. They had a very high level of performance in their mission, and when they came back, they still had a lot of energy. In the other group that had to figure everything out as they were moving in, they used all areas of their brain. They were more prone to making mistakes because they were using all their senses at the same time. And on top of that, when they came back, they were completely exhausted. And the way it transfers to our athletes actually competing, it's really important for them to understand that when they prepare well, when they have a plan for competition, they develop a blueprint that will help them recognize what's important in order for them to perform at a very high level. And whenever something happens that was not, let's say, expected, then they have lots of energy left in order to react well. So the preparation they've done before they compete will not lock them into this plan, but will liberate a lot of energy in order to react well if something unexpected happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I have a question regarding goal setting. Do you know any situation where it could be detrimental, creating anxiety, or is it always better to set the goals instead of not setting goals?
Yes, I think if the goal setting is done well and it's self-reference, so they have full control over whether they can achieve the goal or not, I think there's no problem. I think when you start setting goals that are at risk of not being reasonable to achieve because they're outside your control, then it can be detrimental.
There's no situation. You don't think that sometimes athletes are not open or are not in a situation that they can really cope with the goals that should be given to them?
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. But I would argue then that the work has not been done well before they ended up in that situation. But you're right. If you misunderstand how it works, for example, you've seen in many situations, if you have a goal at a championship and you start feeling the beginning of an injury, for example, you may misread the symptoms because your feelings are overridden by the fact that you really want to achieve a good performance at the championship. So definitely it can be a blinding factor for some really important analyses.
Thank you very much, Nick.